Hope you can hear me. I'm going to give a talk that focuses primarily on the making of the tapestries. But first, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Kate McFarlane and Mary Doyle from the drawing room for facilitating this event. Because, as well as being very tricky to make, the tapestries are expensive, with a huge bulk of that expense going on kind of man-hours processing the data. And so by allowing me to kind of hold this event here, Kate and Mary made it possible for me to apply for funding. So I went to the Arts Council for the weaving costs and back to the Wellcome Trust for the artist's books. And I should also mention the drawing room team, Laura Eldret, Marianne Templeton, Ruben Henry, Yamuna Ravindran, who put together the study reading list, which gave me a lot of pleasure to do. So we've all been asked to kind of contribute books that we think relate to this symposium, and the drawing room have bought them, and they're in that study room now, which is really, really pleasurable. Adrian Hack, I should thank, and Andy Bedimer. But finally, I want to thank the speakers, not only for agreeing to take part in this symposium today, but for the many conversations about contemporary art mark making that we've kind of shared over many years. And all of the speakers here today, including the chair Ed, whose idea for kind of notes on making, which is what I'm doing now, I've basically nicked, have profoundly influenced my thinking, and I'm incredibly grateful for them. As part of a small arts award for public engagement with science, the Wellcome Trust funded the first 3 tapestries, where I worked with scientists from based at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford to make the work that's now permanently installed there. And I need to mention Ruth Charity from the NHS Arts Link Trust for her commitment to this project. She really helped make it happen. And also Professor Russell Foster and Dr. Katharina Wolf, who are the chronobiologists who I worked with in Oxford, who lent me the watches and assisted with the data processing and supplied many answers and even more questions about the body, its internal clock, and the disturbances to this that a 24/7 lifestyle during a period of high capitalism can cause. And this is Russell. So Professor Russell Foster is, yes, he's doing his kind of Hamlet moment, is a circadian neuroscientist or chronobiologist, and he studies the sleep cycles of the brain. And his argument that is that exposure to light influences our sleep-wake patterns. But we don't pick this light up in the normal way through the rods or cones, but there's a third kind of photoreceptor in the eye that detects light-dark differences and feeds the information to the circadian system. So, as Foster argues, we have embedded within our genes the instructions for a biological clock that marks the passage of approximately 24 hours. And counter to the endless day of many of our sort of the first world cities and the workplaces within them, we need periods of both light and dark to help us synchronize this inner clock with the outside world. And it's interesting that we have a clock that operates in the same way that a natural cycle of sun up, sun down does, on which watch is originally based. But this outside world is becoming ever more artificial, ever more manipulated, and culturally and socially constructed, with daylight saving time and shift work, for instance, just 2 examples of this manipulation. Anyway, so he's giving his TED talk here, and it's a really interesting talk. If you have time to look it up, I really kind of urge you to do it. It's sort of, my joke is as far as sleep is concerned, it will really wake you up. And as Maggie mentioned, the art philosophers, Jonathan Crary's recent book, 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, which has been bought for the drawing room and it's in the study, is also very interesting. Crary argues pretty much in the same vein as Russell Foster that our time for sleeping is being slowly eaten up by work and social pressures and artificial light. And less than a third of our time now is spent in what the philosopher Hannah Arendt would describe as the darkness of sheltered existence, a twilight that suffuses our private and intimate lives. And without this time, and it's not just darkness, it's just aloneness that is slowly being, we have very little time left when we're not being marketed to in some way or another. This is a very strong argument of Crary's book, actually. But without this time or space for privacy, as Arendt would argue, the singularity of selfhood is being eroded. Anyway, so sitting at the printers the other day, I found myself looking at a number of year planners. I'm always obsessed with year planners, even though I've stopped working with them, and they were all pinned around the walls and kind of covered with unruly scribbles and scrawls and crossing out. There seems some kind of rebelliousness operating, but nevertheless, they pretty much dictated the structure of the working week. You felt that kind of strongly, but the imposition of time on our working day, in its standardized and regularized form, was not always met with such compliance. When clocks were first brought in during the Industrial Revolution, they were placed kind of iconically above the factory gates. But as Jay Griffiths has pointed out in her book, Pip, Pip, A Sideways Look at Time, workers, and textile workers in particular, were so angry at the idea that their own time was to be possessed by somebody else that they smashed them. It was as if what they considered their birthright, that you own your own body and you own your hours, was being taken away, and the idea that someone else could take possession of your time felt like a terrible theft. And it's really extraordinary that in just a couple of hundred years, people have just come to accept that much of their time, their life, their hours, can in fact belong to someone else. And as Griffith suggests, we've invented these incredibly sophisticated, subtle technologies, and then we've used them to oppress ourselves. And we all know this, but it was still astonishing for me to come across in Jeremy Deller's installation in Venice this year, the Motorola WT4000. And this is, I really loved his plastic arm coming out the wall, actually, as well. There's this one on the wrist, like a cross between a tagging, I should go back to it, like a tagging device, a handcuff, and a kind of watch. These devices are used to track worker efficiency, and this sort of wall the wall thing in Venice just took the sort of the blurb from Motorola, so I think people like Amazon used them, and basically can calculate if the worker is falling behind schedule and send warnings to inform him or her of the situation. Anyway, so I also wore a watch, an ActiWatch, that tracked my periods of activity and rest, and I did so for quite some time, sporadically since 2005, when I used it to make the actigraphs, and then continuously for 5 years as I developed the tapestry work. And as Maggie has explained, I came to using these devices after an encounter with an image of a graph that reminded me of the work I was making at the time, the year planning work. But I was attracted by the technology used to make this graph, attracted by the technology, because I thought it would cut out or minimize the range of choices or personal decisions that were seeping into the making processes of quite a lot of the work I was doing to this point. Work that used a set of rules or a limited range of actions to bring about a kind of desired headlessness. Michael Newman might be saying more about what we mean by this later, but nevertheless, so I had this thing set up so I would not be making any choices, but many of my own personal decisions crept in and directed that outcome, and sort of even just being in a shop and choosing a year plan and just choosing a red one over a green one, sort of weighed things in certain directions, because then the pen I would use to fill it in would, I would have my own system of coding things, which was probably based on, personal choice aesthetics. Anyway, this is the first watch I wore. It's the AW4, and it recorded activity and light, but it had to be downloaded every 3 weeks, which is why the actigraphs they show sort of chunks of time of no more than about 21 days. This is the flyer for the ActiWatch Lite. So it detects and logs movement. It can be used to measure activity or the absence of it over time. It also measures and stores external light intensity, therefore enabling the effect of light intensity on circadian rhythms to be studied. And then the data stored in the watch and downloaded to a PC for analysis. And I was using software called El Temps, the time, to produce a visualization of data that I got. And so you'd recognize from the frameworks that Maggie showed, I was really just taking them straight from the lab. I'd hand over the watch, and the technicians would download the data and say, this is the graph, what do you want to do with it? And I just didn't want to make any kind of changes at all. I just wanted to kind of be loyal to that sense of it being very much a kind of, indexical mark. And this is the software that the chronobiologists use, but they are actually approximations, sort of generalizations, visualizations. And so rather than reproduce these graphs, I wanted to work, when I made the tapestries, I wanted to work from the data itself. So very quickly, one of these spectrographs, the night is centered in the graphs, and that's what the scientists are interested in, so I followed that convention. So configuring the data so the clock starts at around 6 or 7 p.m. And I'll explain why I don't know, 6 or 7. The time shifts a bit as the recordings go on, as they get longer. The diptych piece was the only time I deliberately set up a kind of comparison. They recorded a 3-week period under the dull skies of February in London, and then I spent 3 weeks in the more intense light and higher altitude of the Swiss mountains in April, both in the same year. And I imagined that the graphs would look dramatically different, but this is when I discovered this thing that you have this kind of, you have a certain mode of sleeping, and that's you're stuck with it, really. I mean, you can sort of get help if you've really got serious disturbances, but basically you are either a morning person or an evening person, and it's really, this is like the footprint of my body clock, and so all that really differs about them. There was a bit of an event because I was ill one day, and there's a day when I sort of spent in bed, not moving very much, but really it's the light intensity, and you can see in Switzerland there's virtually no light pollution, it's kind of pitch dark. Horizontal lines of changing colour represent one day, and the colour scale for light goes from black to red, and for activity from blue to yellow. Also, this software, it kind of repeats the 24-hour cycle, so the information takes the form of a kind of loop spiral. That's why it's kind of doubled. So these are just short chunks of time that I was kind of recording and then printing out and putting on the wall. But I realized I had a kind of opportunity to do something a bit bigger once the Wellcome Trust funding became possible. And so I decided to wear the watch for a whole year and had to download it 24 times during that year. And I can show you later where on the tapestry where those downloads actually take place. And bets were taken on whether I could do it or not, but clearly the guys at the Wellcome Trust had not reckoned on working with a very obsessive archivist artist. How did it end up going on for 5 years? Well, by the time I'd sort of worked out I wanted to make a tapestry, done the research for it, and then solved the technical problems, realised how big they were being, organised where in the hospital we were going to be able to hang them, I was already into the 3rd year of recording, and then I like sets of 3 or 5, so, I had to go to 5. And the one at the front is 5 continual years of my activity sleep-wake patterns. My original idea, when I first started collecting it, actually doing this year-long project, was that I was going to do a very long print, and I would have taken the idea that I would just take the whole length of a roll of paper and the width, and just kind of like configure the data to use all of that. And at the time, when we were first talking about this, the hospital had these really long corridors, so the idea was that I would just put these very long, rolls filled with the data down them, like big maps. But I ended up making the tapestries, and so this is one of them. This is an activity from the year 2011. You might have noticed, actually, in some of the ones that Maggie was showing, that there's these gaps in this particular year, these 2 lines that go down. And that's because I lost some data. We're moving house, and I just downloaded too late. And you'll see these stripes of no data coming up each time this particular recording is woven, because so, although kind of digital media, as I will try and suggest, perhaps has no substance, it has a consistency. So the tapestries are listed as being made from silk, cotton, or wool yarn, but as far as a description label might go, that is their medium. But their primary medium is data, the digital recording. What is this? It's not a recording in any material sense, a mark, a notch, inscription, or reaction of chemicals or light upon a surface. It's nothing more or less than a unit of difference, a set of values in relation to another set of values. And in the various sort of bits of publicity and the many written applications of money I've done over the years to keep going with this project, one of the things I tend to say a lot is the data I collect is translated directly into coloured yarn. And it's a very seductive phrase, but I wanted to put pressure on that claim because, so I think it can be kind of broken into two parts. The first part being that the tapestry is a direct translation of this data, and the other part, which is whether because of this, whether the data tapestry can be categorized as an indexical mark, a mark or sign, in other words, that has a direct physical relation to its reference, a referent or cause. And there's a sub-clause to that statement. It's a direct relation to its referent or cause. And there's a sub-clause to that statement. I'd like to unpick the word direct because the referent in this case is the restless body, driven by something unstable, invisible, something that can't easily be located, and that often comes from nowhere. I mean, the tapestries capture tendency or behavior, which arguably is kind of irreducible to anything other than those kind of vague terms. And so although they do, can be categorized as indexical, what they signal might be closer to what Walter Benjamin, in a description of photography, described as smoke without fire. But I'm going to consider all those ideas in a very nerdy way and concentrate on the description of the process, which, as you will see, whilst being direct, is nevertheless kind of informed and governed by certain of my own decisions, quirks of the software, the loom, and the yarn itself. So I wanted to make a tapestry that was completely accurate and with every recorded minute represented. And at the end of the year, I ended up with these enormous strings of numbers. This is this tiny, tiny fragment of what I would collect at the end of each year, which is over 500,000, 525,600 of these numbers or values. So a sample for every minute of the day of the year. And actually, for the first 3 years, there were two streams of data, one for activity and the other for light. And it's quite interesting to look at it. It's quite interesting that it looks like this on the screen, because I just copied and pasted a tiny section of these numbers from the text file that they were in, and Keynote, which is the software I use to make these presentations, automatically put it into this font at this size, and even positioned it where it is now. So at the very start of this kind of technical explanation, you can see that the substance I'm working with has no fixed form. While of course the information itself stays exactly the same. How I see it, how it's visualized, and how it's read changes depending on what I open it up in, or how I process it. So here is this question about what exactly is the media. I could have imported the data into so many different programs to produce completely different results. I could have made music out of it, or I could have made a 3D print, which I did for one day. This is an image of a single day's recording. It shows light exposure down one side and activity over that 24-hour period over the other. But I was really set on making a tapestry, so I needed to convert this data into a form that could be read by the Jacquard Loom's software. Very quickly, the Jacquard was really important. I wanted it to be an automatic drawing or automatically generated thing, not handmade. But I wanted the Jacquard loom for its associations with the Industrial Revolution The Jacquard loom was the first invention to mechanize human labor, so it's directly connected to the development of the time, motion, and worker productivity studies that are so relevant today. So it's also a precursor to the computer. Punch cards were used, well, they're basically early versions of zeros and ones. It's a sort of binary system. So I got someone to write a script that would convert the data into a file that could be read by Photoshop, because most of the work is actually done in Photoshop from this point onwards. And I don't know whether the designers of the software anticipated that it would be used this way, but the reason that Photoshop's so useful is, for what I was trying to do, is that it allows you to work with an indexed color file. That is a file that consists of a set of instructions which can be interpreted and linked to any other set of instructions, in this case, in the case that we're doing a color palette. So the information stays the same, but we control every pixel and what color that pixel can be. This is the data from the 1,440 minutes of each day for each of the 365 days of the year, with an index color value allocated to the corresponding numerical values in the original data file. And we sorted out the days and the minutes into a form that roughly corresponded to clock and calendrical time. So all the minutes go. So the top left-hand corner, which is off the screen, is the beginning of the year 2010, 1st of January. Thanks. Up there. And then the 365 days of 1 pixel per day go across, and then 1,440 pixels go down in these columns, those streams. So we did that, and you can see, yes, the pixel size, 365. So it looks like a sort of image, but it isn't. It's a piece of information still. Then we can offset the data. I shifted it down 7 hours to get night down the center. Then with the file that I'd produced with the script, the weaver made another file in which he identified all the colors. The default range of colors in the Mac system is 256, and so we picked out all the ones that this bit of information didn't use, and then we reduced the total number of colors to 40 values, 37 colors and some left over for some other things. So we still have a grayscale, but we have now different shades of this gray that all can be located and loaded with a color palette and like this. So then we've chosen 37 colors. I can say a little bit more about the fact that the weft there are like 12 bobbins on the loom, and so we knew we could use, we wanted to use 10 of those and 2 of them for the borders. So with the 10 weft colours that we could use, the maximum kind of combinations were 37. I can go into that more later, actually. So that's just showing that you can actually see so that's number sort of 17 on that palette, and you can this is blown up, so you can locate all incidences. I was hoping to get a pointer, and I took this photo with a pointing, but that's number 28. So all the instances of a pixel that corresponds with that number on the color palette can be easily located. You see, I grab that one there, and I can change it. I can manipulate it in any way. So the basic component of the tapestry is this file. This is hugely blown up of just these 1,440 pixels by 365 pixels and this indexed palette. This is a single day of day's worth. Actually, it's a small part of a single day. So at this stage, we needed to think about other possible instructions to give to the loom, because I wanted to make something quite spectacular and big, and, we've just got this tiny, I was kind of terrified when we first started doing this. It was literally this tiny, you couldn't even print it. It was so bad quality. It was just a tiny amount of pixels. And so I wanted to use the maximum width of the loom, for instance, which was just under 3 meters. And I wanted to, so I needed to enlarge it, but to do it in a way that was logical and true to the data. And so we were able to use another function in Photoshop, which is really useful. And we could increase the width allocated to each day, because you can do this thing called using nearest neighbor. You can blow up the, you can enlarge the file, but you do it in a way which is just repeating to make identical copies of each pixel, so that now each minute of each day consists of this rectangular shape, 9 pixels wide and 1 pixel high. But this is, although it still sort of looks like maybe like an image, it's not an image, it's just an instruction to the loom to pick up a corresponding width or number of warp threads. Warps are the one that go that way, the weft goes across. So to say, okay, we need, so each minute would be the length of a single thread, and the length, or the kind of height, if you like, of a single thread, and the width of 9 pixels worth of warp threads. So that's, and then we applied it to all the data to get this kind of elongated landscape form, which I later then put a border on. And this is basically the closest I'd get to making a sort of drawing from the data, and I have printed out some drawings for tapestries. And I like to print them 1-to-1 pixels, so although the data is vast, it's usually, if I print them out, they're tiny little things because of the resolution of the printer being 300 dpi. This might be getting really nerdy, but I don't want to kind of change anything, so it has to be like cast exactly as it is from the data, depending on what printer I use. And the colours here are just stand-ins for, they look like the ones I kind of wanted to use, but I still had to choose kind of actual colours, the yarns that go on the loom. This is zooming in. You'll recognise this from the image that Maggie was showing of the actual tapestry where I went to New York and I, did the time shift. But these are literally just the pixels that have just been given a colour palette and then expanded. Anyway, so I had to go and get these choose the actual yarns, and this proved more difficult than I thought it would be. I had to learn quite a lot about colour theory, which was in fact developed by and for the weaving trade. And it's a necessity because the loom always uses colours in combination with other colours. There always has to be at least 2 threads to kind of put it together. So there's a high risk of clash, and things don't always go the way you might instinctively think. And one more thing, is that at this point we had the width calculated because we knew how many warp threads that we needed to divide the 365 days by, but we didn't know the height of the tapestry because that depends on the thickness of the yarn. We knew that we were going to use 1 shot for each minute, so we knew we were going to get 1,440 shots, but so we could kind of make a rough calculation, with some knowledge. The weaver had knowledge of what the yarn, or how the yarns would behave, but we still needed to run like actual tests just to kind of see what would happen. And I had in my head that I wanted to use certain colours. I knew it had to go from black to red. That was the convention of the chronobiologists. But I chose all these colours that I thought were really perfect, and they made the most horrible combination. I think the weaver just did this. I scanned this yesterday on the scanner just to kind of show me what can go wrong. And then we spent a lot of time choosing other yarns. They all have lovely names, actually. This is London birds we use for the border, raven black and gull grey. And I ended up making these. This is another kind of test thing. I actually brought them in. You can see where I'm getting colours that, despite what the projector seems to be giving us, are actually very close to where I ended up and what I was kind of had in my mind. That's my yarn list. There's one other step. It goes from this image, the image or the set of instructions are coloured pixels. It does go into a piece of software which is the contemporary modern equivalent of a Jacquard card. And this is a tiny, tiny, tiny segment of it because it's really, really huge. And that is how the loom reads it. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I wanted to show a little bit of the little film. Yeah? So in it goes, and then I just wanted to show you the loom computing the data, or weaving the thing. I hope it's not going to be too loud. So this is, I got... So the movement of the loom is programmed by the data from my body. So you can see every thread going across is a minute. The days building up. So there's a minute that's gone down, and then these are the days building up. Yeah, I mean, it was. I think as accurate as you could get. I'm going to go back to my presentation now. I really liked the way that the loom itself was incredibly noisy. It felt like a kind of heartbeat. It was just like almost like an animal. It was kind of terrifying sound. These are the 5 years. Not much changes. But this is quite a good one, 2013, because not much at all happened. I didn't go traveling, I didn't lose any data. And you can see this curve, and that curve is caused by the body adjusting to daylight saving time. And you'll see in the 5-year one what an impact that has on the dark space of sleeping. As Maggie was saying, the light ones, I configured the time so that day was down the centre, so that it starts at 100 hours. These are sort of drawings of that then became tapestries. Terribly out of focus. And then this is the last. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say actually that I made every 1-year tapestry, so I collected in 2012, say, and I'd make it January 2013. I tried to make it as soon as possible. And there's something, each tapestry has something about that time kind of embedded in it, because things happened, like one of the yarns went out of production, sort of a company went bankrupt, it's also the kind of different kind of things that happen. One of the blacks changed, and I quite like that, but because they kind of add to the sense of real-time passing and real events that kind of impact on them, even though the same basic components build them up. I'm going to sort of fast forward a little bit, but so this is the drawing for the tapestry that's on the wall at the moment, and yeah, so it's 5 years, and you can see, summertime, daylight saving time, doing this and doing it again in the evenings. It's much clearer on the actual tapestry, and so you can see that kind of darkness is our time for sleeping and rest is really crunched, and it's all about maximum productivity. Get up in the morning, get working, or I'm being cynical, but you can really see an impact on the body. And so I actually, the very first tapestry, the 1-year one, I had the time, or the clock down the side, starting at 7 o'clock, and by the end of the 5 years, I had to start the clock at 4 o'clock in order to keep the whole of that, the variability of those 5 years. So that just shows how things change. And I suppose, I was just wondering, why go to all that trouble to make that thing? And there's a relatively small piece there that took 5 years. Why didn't I just paint it, or kind of, I engage with pictorial abstraction in my work. So, why didn't I just just, why did it have to be this thing? And I think I'm very interested in accumulation, like a kind of creeping accumulation of stuff. I'm attracted to this mode of working that does what Sabold's pattern books did. Look as if it's not made by the hand of man, to look instead like a product of nature itself. To look at, Sabold has this lovely expression when he says it looks like it's, like the feather of birds, and Lacan, the psychoanalyst, would use remarkably similar terminology. So he says he's, basically like a leaf that falls, or a snake's skin when he casts the skin. And he's interested in, Lacan talks about this rain, this thing that rains from the painter's brush, which hasn't got anything to do with any actual choices. It's this other thing. And I guess I'm interested in gathering that. So, and it's this idea of something creeping and accumulating like dust, it kind of implies something barely kind of perceptible, incremental, that goes on kind of out of sight. And I think that a certain darkness is involved there as well. And it's a complete opposite of collecting in the connoisseur or even kind of obsessive fan sense. It's much more an automatic blind accumulation. Just to end, I was just saying, once you keep going for these lengths of time, the relationship of the recordings to my individual self kind of drops away a bit, and these resulting graphs, diagrams, or tapestries, you start to say a lot more about a contemporary subjectivity, the social cultural environment in which I live and work, which is, Northern European city, under a period of high capitalism. I probably said that a few times. Which, they just show me as just another kind of typical citizen in a 21st century city driven by these 24/7 modes of productivity, crawling in my creaturely way across this kind of net of calendrical and clock time. I want to end by just saying, the body keeps its, I'm interested in that resistance, because the body keeps its own time, it has its own internal rhythms, and these are not so logical and are perhaps more mutable, synchronic. Digital technology allows me to capture data that has this direct physical relation to its reference. In other words, to make this mark that is also an indexical sign. But what the data tracks is peculiar because it has no precise location. Movement, restlessness, for example, comes from nowhere in particular. Its cause and motivation can't be pinned down. In addition, and unlike other media, the output of this digital recording is arbitrary. Data can be, as I'm saying, is visualized in many ways. And I think that interestingly reflects the nebulous and migratory character of this thing that I'm trying to record. In the case of the tapestries, this bodily unconscious that resists kind of something and instead goes its own way. So I realised I photographed the 3 watches this morning. I was going to put them on, but I thought they were still recording, so I was like, no way. Horrendous. I think we're breaking for questions now, yeah? Yeah, questions.
My name's Ed Kirchner. Susan asked me to chair a few questions. I also feel myself in a dubious position as the timekeeper given the nature of the discussion, but I don't know, Maggie and Susan, you want to...
We should sit back here then.
So, any questions from the floor?
Yeah, I could maybe start with them.
Where's the... behind you.
That's throwing me. I wondered if the wearing of the device had actually affected your behaviour in any way, and whether the wearing of it and the knowledge of the wearing of it affected your behaviour, and also the accumulation of data that's sort of grown up behind you by a certain point, whether looking back at it sort of affected the way you looked forward at any point.
I think I used to say absolutely no, because I got so used to having it on my wrist, and life's too short to kind of, because it's there all the time, to constantly factor in something about, perhaps my behaviour. I mean, I was aware sometimes that I might be laying down some red, if I was running or drank too much coffee. But that the very kind of nature of something that makes my heart go faster, not being easily sort of, traced, made any attempts. Like I said, the Swiss and London diptych was the only time I kind of consciously tried to construct some sort of comparison to see if my behaviour, I really did loads of walking Switzerland. I thought there was going to be this is going to be fantastic, but it was exactly the same as if I just stayed in London the whole time, the way I was sleeping.
It looked like Dartmoor. You had very sound sleep.
Yeah, that's true because there's no light pollution.
True, yes.
Honestly, you get that synesthetic feeling that I'm staying still, I'm making black, or I'm moving around, I'm making red.
Well, I mean, I was aware that I very occasionally thought this. Actually, one time I nearly missed a plane in Berlin. And it had been this very, very long run. Well, it was a run in my case to the airport. And I remember thinking, oh well, at least there'll be some red this day. It was completely horrible. And we had been up all night partying as well, so I knew that it was going to be quite a peculiar act to graph. 3 nights in Berlin.
Yeah,
That was,
right.
yeah.
Yes.
But I did actually once get contacted by the Science Museum, and they said, oh, we're really interested in people who are doing this kind of life, because when I started, not many people were wearing those kind of Nike bands and stuff. Now everyone's wearing them, and there was a sense that you could improve yourself if you wore them. And luckily, the project's gone on so long that they've now been proven to make you, to really sort of, they fuck you up, basically. So people shouldn't wear them, and you become obsessed with training or whatever. So there was a time when everyone was wearing them, and Science Museum contacted me and said they wanted to do an exhibition about people who had adapted their behaviour in response to these devices. And I started talking to them about, how I was sort of against all these, I really wanted to record something that couldn't be recorded, that was into this protesting body, that there was all these other kind of agendas, and I could feel it was one of these horrible conference conversations. They said, we're all here, tell us about your project. And I could feel the room going kind of really cold, and they just did not want to have anything to do with me. I was, I don't know how that exhibition panned out, but I was definitely not right for them.
It's a kind of open question to both of you. But it's about chance and contingency in this work. Because in a way I can see, Susan, that you're giving up a lot, you're not making choices in a sense in this. But then when people wear those watches, sports people, they're kind of identifying with contingency and they're mastering it by identifying with it. And then this kind of notion of an unruly body in this work, and some kind of unconscious as well, but it seems to me like it's the most rational language of all. And that actually, there's no chance or contingency in this, because all it is a kind of mapping. And I just wonder, a mapping, I suppose. And obviously it's always a failed map, because no map's going to be adequate. But I wonder what the role of chance or contingency is in this, or in a way, whether you're actually sort of mastering it by identifying with it.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Maybe you can, because I made it quite a to-do about that precise issue. And actually, I come from a kind of interest in photography and casting and imprint and that kind of thing. And I think, kind of what attracts me to photography is the kind of surprise you get when you see what you've cut, that it's kind of an instrument of discovery, if you like. It's not, totally within the agency of the artist. You could say that art never is within the agency of the artist, but anyway, that there's something particular about this, the nature of light-sensitive paper, whatever, that that you sort of spot. Oh my God, there's a shadow, across the whole of this image that I didn't even see, rather beautiful, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of contingency and this automaticity that I find, kind of a liberation from so regulation and registration, that it's unexpected, and that's the kind of view that Marianne Down puts forward as well, the kind of rupture in the fabric of our daily existence through these indexical mediums. Actually, she gets that from Peirce. The book is sort of penetrated by Charles Sanders Peirce, who had a similar view.
Does that also still feel like something so small in such a, this huge database is so rationalized, and then we're putting so much weight on this little indexical rupture within that, and it feels, I understand what you mean, and I think powerful at some level, but also not on another level, faced with all of this.
Yeah. Well, it's a kind of two-sided thing, that you want to represent the conditions of our existence, as it were, the control, and also, to see beyond that, to somehow register something beyond that.
I mean, that's why I put it, so I configured it to correspond to calendrical time. So I deliberately put it into a grid form. I didn't have to. But I mean, I think that's that thing of contingency within a structure that Maura Davey was talking about. So the data is kind of held by this scaffolding, as all of us are in a way, by the scaffolding of organised time. So I just wanted to make that clear, really. But actually, can I just say this? That's not to say that I think that my life is spent kind of doing things that are outside of that. I mean, I probably am living in a very regulated way. I live the same way. I'm very aware when I kind of go to catch a train or something. When the train draws up, loads of people all come out together. I'm just I'm moving around the city in these organised kind of time slots. I don't do much else outside of that. Sorry.
Thanks. My question is in the same sort of ballpark about agency and contingency, but it's a bit more prosaic maybe, which is that you mentioned that the original impetus for the project was to avoid personal choices in the work. But as it went along, it became clear that you actually made quite a lot of choices in this work that were especially important in terms of the translation from what you would call data collection to the actual piece.
Yeah.
So colour, scale, the use of a particular loom which has historical resonances,
Absolutely.
and the plotting of the axes maybe is the most important, deciding where night goes, where day goes, which really enormously alters what the piece looks like. So I wondered if you could go more into that, how you felt about making these choices, having initially decided that the whole point was to get rid of them.
Yeah, I guess I would say that that's unavoidable. I know you start off with the best intentions, but those choices are things that I would say I've tried to limit my own kind of aesthetic choices. The reason that the data goes down the middle, the night goes down the middle, though it looks kind of quite attractive, I think, is actually following the conventions of the chronobiologists. So I was just following those rules. Obviously, I say that in a tongue-in-cheek way, but I mean, there were many, many things like the sort of capricious behaviour of the software dictated and sent things in different directions, and I had to respond to that. So that's why I said, I start off thinking I'm going to be doing this direct translation, but the reality is it goes hop, hop, hop from one thing to another. And, when I chose the colours, for instance, I've actually brought in some samples because I just thought it might be interesting. I chose the colours, tried to go on my own feeling about colour. This is a sort of test strip. I just lie it there maybe. That's where you can see I'm getting it right. But here is the failure. And so the colours were dictated by the spectrum and by the logic of the weaving. I wasn't free. That was like the horrendous kind of disaster. I was so disappointed when I came in the morning. And then once the weaver sort of took me in hand and said, "Look, you've got to follow these rules." Then, I was also limited. So I know what you're saying, and I'm admitting to it. This is the width of the loom. So this is how big the pieces are, wide at least, and then they go up. And these were the sort of test strips we were doing. We finally got it right. I had to catch the train actually to get home, and so we only got 1 inch of the right one. And But yeah.
Gosh.
I just wanted to ask something around diaries in artist diaries, and what the overlap is between you creating the sort of the activity and light ones, and then the series where you're using, was it Evernote, to document absolutely everything that you were kind of coming across, and whether those were happening at the same time, and I guess sort of what you're feeling about that kind of data or that kind of information, or your presence in them is.
Yeah, well, I was interested in the diary because it's such a, it's the ultimate kind of unreliable narrator, really. You always start off every day with a new kind of I that might not agree with the I that you wrote from the night before. Again, the diary project, which Maggie showed bits of, it's influenced by Rings of Saturn by Seybold, who uses an I that kind of migrates through various texts, quotes other writers, doesn't acknowledge them necessarily. And I was interested in that I, this empty shifter, as Krauss would say, what you could do with it, especially if I decided to try to keep using it for a whole year in a very sort of, oh God. I don't really want to say this, but, to record my sort of feelings or my observations. I mean, that's sort of like, I guess, my encounters with things. I would say this and I'd just put it all in, But then that would go along with all the receipts. So I would say, I'm queuing for the bus, it's late again. But then, a bus ticket might come and then, there'd be bits of language on the ticket, bits of, when I go and buy my food, you were served today by Marianne, and, different kind of, so then other eyes take over from my eye and kind of start narrating it for me. And I was aware of it being almost like the polar opposite of the recording project, but I just wanted to, just try and work from that other end at the same time. And my little book that's over there has a bit of the diary in it, actually, and you can see how it works. Do you want to say something about diaries?
Well, I thought you were trying to do it in as much of the same spirit as the ActiWatch as possible within the constraints of diary form. In other words, quite a lot of it is, just photographic where you happen to be, so it's indexical or these computer printouts. So, and then there is this, kind of the recordings that get transcribed onto it as well. But I thought it was interesting that this is another one of those aesthetic decisions, I suppose, that you had thought of scanning all the receipts and so on. And that would have been an easier way to do it. But that looked too much like sort of like a collage.
No pictures. Yeah,
like pictures. So that she had it transcribed. So that it's more like, continuous data stream.
So you read it as part of the text and,
Your work is informed by neuroscience on the one hand. In fact, you're using a kind of neurotechnology, and at the same time, it's also informed by psychoanalysis. I mean, your interest is quite clear. Do you see any tension between the two, and how do you negotiate it in your work? And also, this question is for Maggie in reading Sarah's work, if you have any.
It's not really neuroscience. Do you do neuroscience? It's chronobiology, which is.
I think Russell categorized himself as a neuroscientist.
Woody,
well.
right.
I just noticed that recently.
Yeah, but I think you're right in identifying, kind of two threads, a kind of rigorous empiricist scientific model and a project that is imbued with psychoanalysis through and through, I'd say.
I mean, the scientists, even in the field of chronobiology, there are two or more conflicting kind of schools. And so the Ellen MacArthur sort of graph that you saw of her sleep-wake patterns, and she'd been trained to sleep for these tiny, tiny little moments in order to do this solo circumnavigation. She was trained by this guy, Professor Stamke in MIT, and he believes that sleep is a total waste of time. We can all be supermen, and we can just train ourselves to just have 10-minute naps, and be like Margaret Thatcher or whatever. So and Russell Foster and the team in Oxford, and increasingly more people are kind of agreeing with him, say that we really need to sort our sleep patterns out and not kind of not kind of totally sign up to this 24/7 lifestyle. Actually, it's a little bit. It's not just that the 9 to 5 is difficult. We should move. Like teenagers shouldn't start school until midday because they're useless before then. There's a problem then because they should keep going. Teenagers should come in at 12 and go on till sort of 7, 8, or 9 o'clock. But all the tutors are asleep by 4. So there's a kind of problem. But anyway, so there's conflicting ideas. But I think psychoanalysis and science. I need to think more about that. I mean, it's a kind of interesting question. I would say they were completely incompatible, but I think you can kind of,
Maybe that's where some of the tensions from the earlier questions come from, with regards to control and making everything mechanical, and then the chance and how you deal with the chance and how it affects.
It was important for me to use a piece of technology that was used by the scientists for a specific task, and I've used other kind of recording devices in more sort of not in a bit sort of not in such a kind of loyal way, but it was important that these recordings were directly from the thing that I was looking at, so I wanted the science for that.
I'm struck by the poetic quality of the tapestries and the way that they reflect the diurnal rhythm, the changes in that rhythm. And it brings to my mind the liturgical hours, matins, Vespers, Compline, and all the others. And in particular, the Church of England service of Evensong, where the third collect, or prayer, runs something like this. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy, preserve us from the perils and dangers of this night. I find this an incredibly resonant prayer. In fact, part of it, the opening words, lighten our darkness, go back at least 3,000 years to the Psalm of David as he was on his deathbed. And it's those words, lighten, light, dark, perilous, this night, and so on. I'd just like both of you to reflect, if you can, on the analogy that I found when I was listening to your things.
Yes, I mean, my first thought about that would be that, in a way, we're talking about the inverse situation in a society which perhaps has too much light, too much exposure. So we might beseech whoever to give us more darkness so we can hide, so we can shelter from so much light. So it's an interesting observation, but I think that the terms would need to be reversed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the light in our darkness also refers to desire for knowledge and for some kind of understanding as well. And I would say we might need less knowledge as well, less light, because there is, at the moment, there are a number of people who might argue this, that science does actually make claims for certain truths that actually do away with belief systems that many atheists, such as Freud, would say are necessary to some kind of illusion. And there's John Gray's book, recent book at the moment, argues about the dangers of saying that science is always right. I mean, you know, the Nazis used it, for instance, you know, science to validate, kind of. So yeah, we need to stay in the twilight zone, I think, slightly more, like Hannah Arendt's twilight area. Oops, maybe.
Just following up on that, if I could, it seems to me that the effect of the tapestries is very different depending on whether the interval of inactivity, the dark band, is in the middle, where it's sort of framed by the, light, the colourful regions of the tapestry, or in the case of a couple of the more recent tapestries, the darkness is at the bottom of
the edges,
tapestry.
yeah.
And I just wonder, and clearly that's one area where one could make a decision about how to perhaps sort of predicate it along its effect. And I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Well, with the ones that recorded light, the 3-year ones, you had to configure the data in the way that I did, because otherwise the thing you wanted to look at would be at the edges. So this time the night goes to the edges, and we're looking at sun up, sun down. So those bulges, so winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, and then a sort of stream of artificial light from the top third as well. Really kind of aggressively sort of eroding the darkness, I would say, that in quite a kind of frightening way. And also, as Maggie pointed out, the bulges for summer are more prominent in the evening, because there is an impact of social behaviour, because I have curtains that are closed in the morning, so the morning summer light is much smoother, because I open my curtains at more or less the same time every day. So the light only shows the impact of culture, the impact of light and behaviour. But when I was combining the piece that combined light and activity, again, I had to put the light down the centre, because that's what we're looking at. But then you can really see that sort of this natural kind of, the natural rhythm of the seasons, with this, this body that, this activity that does all sorts of things within and outside of both the kind of calendar and the normal working day and the season times of the season. So I think it was just a way of just trying to really show this this unruly, erratic kind of thing crawling along in its creaturely way. And that really does happen when you are at a distance. You see these clear periods of time, but when you go close up, it's all kind of a mess. It's all kind of very noisy mess between the light and the activities, quite competing. That veil, that misty stuff you get.
Hi, I was just curious if you could speak a little bit about mind-body duality, because I thought that. Sorry, my wrist was off. I was curious about your project with the diary as a kind of competitive instinct to you giving voice to your body. And I was wondering if that you could say a little bit about how you conceived your mind and your body when you were doing this, whether you saw them separate or not.
I hadn't thought of it as a competitive thing. Do you want to say more about what you mean by that?
I was struck by what you said about the unreliable narrator of the diary, and something where we kind of enforce our own sort of predispositions and temptations of the mind. And then I was sort of struck by how, obviously you're interpreting the data, you're finding visual symbols for them and all the adjustment, but in a sense, I mean, the whole body hacking movement is giving voice to the silent body or the repressible body. And so I think it's interesting that you did these two things sort of in concert with each other and disrupting that by mechanical intervention, but very much you selecting the receipts and transcribing them. And I saw those as a sort of a competitive voice.
Yeah, I did say that it seemed to be at the opposite end of the spectrum, that, you know, that there is the recording done in the dark, if you like, of the body that's doing what it's doing, and then there's this deliberate kind of recording of things during the day using an app on my phone. So I would kind of, everything that went through this app was chronologically ordered for me. It was quite rigid. So even I'd say, look, that's it, I'm never going to see so-and-so again, or go to that place where, you know, a week later I'd be with so-and-so again, you know, or whatever, you know. So it's a little bit like Nadia, you know, Andre Breton's piece, novel, that, you know, you have this, I don't know how it's going to turn out any more than the reader does. So in that sense, it has this kind of unconscious at work, and I haven't planned what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do for that year. I'm just doing what I'm doing. But I sort of think that where my voice comes in, if it comes in as a kind of like annoying squeaky sound, you know, like a shoe that doesn't quite work. There's so many other things that are going in that take over from me and speak for me, that the eye is very intermittent and often isn't my eye at all.
I'm thinking about the choreographic connotations in the system that you've devised for articulating periods of motion and rest. So I'm curious really about whether and how your own notation system really enters into dialogue with other choreographic notation systems, or whether it does.
I've seen those computer-generated notations for choreography. I sent you, actually, information about that one time. They're very beautiful diagrams of movement that are actually recordings of movement, but diagrammata, as it were. Yeah, I forget the guy who does that thing. But,
it seems as if it chimes with those other projects of measuring and articulating movement and rest that you might find in choreography and systems of notation that you find there.
You think that the way that the data is configured the tapestries remind you of those things in some way?
It's not so much that the tapestries remind me, it seems as if there is a shared endeavour of how do you articulate movement and rest through an abstract notational system.
I mean, those things are aimed at a score. Like, there's always a problem. How do you write a score for a dance? You know, so there are various computer-generated things that you can do. So that is like sort of, you know, repetition of a dance, a composition, of a choreography. Whereas this is tracking. So it has this different relation to time, I think.
And it's a score that writes itself at the time it's being written, rather than is, you know, written afterwards, or to kind of organise something. But I did think that the John Cage Imaginary Landscape score was a very good example of something that is always different every time you play it. So it allows a kind of, again, that sort of structure for contingency to happen.
I thought maybe just before we break, we've got this
it's about 5 to 3, I think. And perhaps to anticipate some things that maybe will come up in Brian's talk and Michael's, I wanted to ask a question about autonomy, both of the subject and the subject of portraiture, and maybe a different kind of portraiture, but also autonomy in relation to the nature of the work, which, just to sort of steal a couple of words from Brian's blurb, you know, it's kind of resolutely sealed, but at the same time absolutely open to the world. So it's a little paradoxical in that sense. So I may be returning to David's question as well about decision making and as an autonomous agent somehow. I wondered if you could speak to either of those aspects of autonomy and how it functions in the tapestry project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Maggie was saying about being tangled in a web, really, to be somehow sort of trapped, no matter what I try to do, that I would open myself up to chance. I'd open myself up to, or you know, make rules that mean that I must be open to surrender my own autonomy, decision-making processes. But the whole time I'm governed by stuff that makes certain things inevitable, and I'm also attracted to things that I can't really resist, or at points when I have to make a choice. I have to pick a certain colour over one over another. You know, so it's almost impossible to give that up, to surrender that completely. But I'm quite interested in that problem.
Yes, I guess the time I was thinking about those issues the most was when I was writing. It was about Hebrew actually, but I got into the notion of instructional works of art, where you sort of set out a rule, but it's kind of like a bit empty, the rule, you know, so that within that rule you have quite a lot of leeway. You know, draw a straight line and follow it. Well, you know, how long? You know, you know, there's this combination.
Is brilliant for that,
and
Cage,
always
he always left room for all those things to happen.
Yes, and I suppose there's something, it's sort of corresponding to one's feeling of, you know, life on Earth. Actually, that we have this system, these structures, these. You know, kind of web in which we're caught, but also some degree of autonomy within that. Does that?
Sometimes maybe it's just like a kind of oscillation.
It's
barely almost moving, but not quite.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's a couple of minutes to 3, so thanks to Susan and Maggie.